America. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. To serve others in ways that promote human flourishing and create a ripple effect of transformation for generations to come. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
If you're like us, dear listener, you're a bit overwhelmed by all of the teeth whitening products on the market. And our next sponsor has provided us with some very interesting facts that we would like to pass on to you.
Fact number 1. Teeth whitening does not whiten your teeth. It removes the stains and restores the tooth to its natural color. Natural colors vary per person, but for most of us, it's an off-white or a slightly yellowish undertone.
Fact 2. Teeth whitening does not damage teeth, but it does temporarily dehydrate. When dehydrated, the pores in the enamel are open and exposed. Open pores invite acids and sugars, which, as we all know, lead to tooth decay. Avoid or minimize acidic and sugary substances for at least 24 hours after whitening. Also avoid staining substances, as the teeth are more susceptible to restaining during this period.
Fact number 3. Tooth sensitivity is the result of tooth dehydration. When the pores of the enamel are open, the teeth become dehydrated, exposing the nerve to the elements. As the tooth rehydrates, the sensitivity will dissipate. To accelerate the rehydration and curb sensitivity, use a post-whitening application known as remineralization or desensitizing gel.
Fact 4. Caps and veneers cannot be whitened because they do not have pores for the stains to latch to. Prior to having dental work, you should whiten your teeth, restoring them to their natural color, as the dentist will be color matching to your current shade.
Fact number 5. The key to teeth whitening is the delivery device. So long as a whitening product is a peroxide-based whitener, it will remove the stains. What differentiates one product from the next is a device that holds the whitening agent to the tooth without interruption.
Whitening strips neglect the crevices and molars, and they slide on your teeth.
Saliva floods the generic trays because they're bulky. They don't create a seal.
Oh, and you likely did not know this, but LED lights are novelty items that add no benefit. You need a high-output UV light only found at the dentist. Don't fall for the gimmick. If you insist on a light that does not work, get one on Amazon for under $5.
The number 1 whitening device recommended by dentists is a custom-fitted tray. You can have your dentist make your trays for $300 to $600, or you can head on over to smilebrilliant.com and use their lab direct mail-in process for a fraction of the price you'd pay at the dentist. Oh, and if you grind your teeth at night, by the way, like me, Kemper, you can also purchase Smile Brilliant's custom-fitted night guards, once again, for a fraction of the price the dentists charge.
Once again, that's www.smilebrilliant.com, and use special All About Agatha coupon code Agatha, AGATHA, you know how it's spelled, for an exclusive All About Agatha discount.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
I'm Kemper Donovan.
Well, I'm a little bit hoarse, and I apologize. We have what some of you might be familiar with, but we have the Santa Anas in Los Angeles right now. And so it's a little dry, I'd say, a little windy.
Very atmospheric. Yes, very atmospheric, and maybe even, a little spooky. I believe Raymond Chandler talks about how the Santa Anas make people do strange things. And maybe that's appropriate for the season and for the book that we are covering in this episode, because that book would be, Halloween Party.
I feel like you had to do it, Kemper, though, with a little apostrophe, like Halloween.
I would just like to point out for everyone, I am a big fan of that apostrophe. I am so committed to it. And the fact that Agatha Christie was too is just, an auspicious sign here for this episode and for our review of Halloween Party.
I will also note that if anybody does not follow our Patreon, we posted a spooky story episode. And first of all, Kemper made a point in the episode notes to also call it the Hallowe'en episode with the apostrophe, and also a spooktacular because he apparently cannot help himself from making dad jokes.
I apparently really love Halloween, I'm realizing this year. And I'm going to have some thoughts, actually, and a little bit of research into Halloween that's coming very soon, actually, for all of you to delight in at the top of the episode. So with that little tease in mind, I should note my first fun fact of the episode is that we do have a working title for Halloween Party. This is per John Kern, of course, and it makes no sense. So I'm not even going to ask you to guess what it is, Catherine, because you never would be able to. It was Easeful Death. I'm at a loss.
Easeful Death?
Easeful Death. I mean, that almost is like the opposite of what I would think maybe this book could be titled. Brutal Death comes to mind, for example. But yeah, supposedly that was a thing. Let's just move swiftly along. Could you tell us a little bit about the publication history of Halloween Party?
Yeah, it's all actually really condensed. Unlike some of these books that we get, it was published by Collins Crime in November of 1969 in the UK, by Dodd Mead, also in 1969 in the US. That was both in book form, and it was abridged and serialized installments in Woman's Own in the UK from November to the end of December of 1969, and in December in Cosmo in the US.
I mean, what's super weird to me about the specific calendar dates of those releases is that they're all right after Halloween. Like, there's no Halloween tie-in whatsoever, which I actually think speaks volumes as to the state of Halloween as a holiday when this book was published, because it wasn't such a big thing in the UK.
In the UK. I mean, even if you go back for decades in the US, you get trick-or-treating photographs of kids. But in the UK, it's more like an American adoption thing, right?
Oh, it absolutely is. I mean, this is, I would actually argue, Agatha Christie's most American novel because it is very much based on an American celebration of Halloween. We know that the inspiration for this story was an actual trip that Christie took to the US in the fall of 1966, exactly 55 years ago to this day. And the reason why she went is that she was going to various university cities with her husband, with Max Mallowan, who was doing a series of lectures. Just for the record, Agatha was also invited to do a lecture series, but she declined. We know that she was not a fan of public speaking. Christie biographer Janet Morgan has a lot of fun facts about this trip to the States. And as an American fan of Christie's, I couldn't resist sharing some of them with you all because I think you'll appreciate them. So first of all, she talks about how everyone in Princeton, New Jersey, quote, seemed very rich, which sounds about right for Princeton, but she seems to have been charmed by Princeton overall. And
really?
We know,
because I might personally have some thoughts about Princeton, Kemper.
Yeah, Princeton, tweet at Catherine and ask her thoughts about Princeton. She'll give you an earful. So we know from Janet Morgan that Christie had two very firm goals on this American trip. One was visiting the grave of Nathaniel Frary Miller, who was her grandfather, since let's never forget Agatha Christie's father, Frederick Miller, was indeed an American. This gravestone was in Greenwood Cemetery, and I have to assume that's the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, though it honestly wasn't specified. I'm sure there are other Greenwood cemeteries, but I think it was that one, and we know that it was quite an elaborate gravestone. She actually compared it to Luxor when she finally did get around to seeing it. So she did see that. This is her second firm goal. I think we're all going to appreciate this. She was intent on picking up some, and I quote, outsized knickers. That's right. Agatha Christie was on the hunt for some big old underwear when she went to the States. Personally, I think it's criminal right now that we're not doing a MeUndies ad spot for the episode, because the transition to that ad right now would be, wait for it, Catherine, seamless.
Oh, God. It's just, you guys, his dad jokes have become out of control. So I just want to be really clear that if you're thinking that, you have to know that I hear this off recording too. So,
by the way, the person I was quoting just now was not Agatha Christie herself, but her longtime and long-suffering agent, Edmund Cork, oh yes, who warned his U.S. counterpart, Dorothy Olding, because let's remember she took over for Harold Ober once he passed away. He warned her as follows: "She remembered your prowess, and I am awfully afraid, sweetie, you are for it." And what he means by that is apparently Dorothy Olding had gotten her hands on, and I'm now quoting Janet Morgan again, quote, "an enormous swimsuit," end quote, for Agatha Christie. So finding these undies was the next task that Christie set out for her U.S. agent. I have no idea if Dorothy Olding succeeded, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that she or some poor assistant working for her did in fact find the underwear that she wanted. Then just a couple more tidbits as to her trip in the States and her opinions on various areas of the U.S. She was profoundly impressed by American Central Heating and the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, by the paintings and sculpture adorning private houses as well as museums in Washington, and by the variety of people she and Max confronted. She adored Vermont in the frosty fall, quote, "lovely scenery and the best real butter I've tasted for years." It's nice to know that her taste for dairy products remained unquenched from her salad days spent imbibing dollops full of Devonshire cream. She apparently rode in a train so dirty and with such bad food that, quote, "I now think better of British railways." But also, per Janet Morgan, and this is really not a sentence I ever imagined myself uttering, Christie was quite impressed by Austin, Texas. This is what she had to say. "Austin, very civilized as well as rich, a quite unexpectedly attractive city." And she and Max went there directly after Ohio, and she noted that they'd gone from snow to warmth, 80 degrees F, and almost a Near East Baghdad feeling of gardens and green trees and leisure, dinner at top of a recent well-built skyscraper, very good food. Sadly, she was not so enamored of Dallas. This is what she had to say about Dallas. "Moneyed, lectured to a very select audience, much too select. Wonderful display of a lone exhibition of carpets. Nobody knew a thing about them or was interested. A dull lot." Apologies to all of you listening from Dallas. And finally, we also know that she spent 4 days in New England during this trip, and that her time there very much inspired a Halloween party, especially since, as Janet Morgan notes, the party itself resembles an American rather than an English celebration of Halloween. And I do just want to talk for a second about the holiday of Halloween, because I think it's actually important for framing this story and the way that it was received, and I think even the way that it's perceived today by a contemporary audience. So I would first just like to acknowledge that the Halloween tradition did in fact begin in the UK, sort of a modern evolution of a Gaelic festival, Samhain, which I'm sure many of you already knew. It's really more of a Scottish and Irish thing, but basically it marked the end of the harvest, the beginning of winter. It was a time when spirits and humans could cross into each other's planes of existence a little more easily. Woo! Apparently, some people wore costumes either to imitate or hide from the spirits. And then Irish and Scottish people emigrated to the US. They brought these traditions over with them. And as always happens in the US, we overdid it hard. And then we commercialized it hard. And now we have like $1 billion industry here, which involves me getting fooled every year into trying candy corn because I see it sitting in a bowl. It looks really good. And then I bite one of them and I reconfirm for the year that, oh my God, it's wax with a little bit of sugar in it. And it's disgusting. So, you know, Halloween is a little
overly mean about candy corn. I'm not going to say that I would eat candy corn, but I think that that is a point of contention. I'd also note that, you know, it's not Samhain, but Day of the Dead in Latin American countries, particularly Mexico, is also incredibly important.
Absolutely. Well, and Ariadne Oliver even makes mention of, you know, traditions in France, right? Flowers left in cemeteries. Of course. I mean, this is very much the Anglophone tradition that I'm talking about here. So things like bobbing for apples and carving faces in vegetables like turnips or swedes, what we would call rutabagas, those are very much traditional English celebrations of the holiday. And then Christie does mention witches' balls at her Halloween party. I had no idea what those were. And apparently
wait, you didn't have a mother that hung them in our house?
Did your mom hang witches' balls?
Yeah, they're blown glass.
Well, I learned on the website witchballs.com, because apparently there really is a website for everything, that, yeah, they're like hollow glass spheres. They're hung in windows to ward off witches' spells, evil spirits, and ill fortune. Like they're supposed to trap the wayward spirits. They get mesmerized by it, and then they touch the sphere and they get absorbed, actually.
We had really beautiful ones when I was growing up. They were like sort of a cerulean blue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was imagining, honestly, when I read that in the book, like a styrofoam ball with pipe cleaner spider legs.
No. They're like we got them from like local art, like handmade blown glass. So yeah, gotcha. They were in windows. I mean, it's a little bit the equivalent of there's a Native American tradition, right, with dream catchers too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, catching something that's of a intangible essence, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read that and I was like, oh, I didn't realize they had those in England.
It's just interesting, the crossover that happens or doesn't happen. The pumpkin thing and the trick-or-treating thing are very much American innovations. And, we see, it's literally on page 1, Ariadne Oliver, she's very bemused as to all the pumpkins she saw in the US on her last visit there. And you can feel that that's very much how Christie felt when she was in the US and in New England. I'll be honest, there even seems to be some confusion as to what a pumpkin looks like, since the pumpkin that appears on the cover of the first edition of the book that was published in the UK, you can, if you go onto Wikipedia and you just search for Halloween Party, the Christie novel, you'll see the cover. It's bright yellow. And then on that first page, Mrs. Oliver holds up a large yellow pumpkin. That's how it's described. And then she wonders aloud about the difference between a pumpkin and a vegetable marrow, mm-hmm. which doesn't quite make sense to me, because isn't a vegetable marrow basically like an overgrown zucchini? Like most of them are green and white, aren't they?
Well, you can have a varietal of like a white pumpkin. They sell them in the stores. So
sure. Yeah. I actually right now have a white pumpkin, a green orange pumpkin, a brown pumpkin, and a regular orange pumpkin, because I have a 5-year-old who likes looking at lots of different kinds of pumpkins. It was just weird to me that she's confused as to the difference between, I get that they're all gourds, but maybe, I guess that's my American centric kind of view, where I'm like, how could you not know what a pumpkin is? It makes me wonder, like, when Poirot retired in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd to grow vegetable marrows, did he have a pumpkin patch in his backyard?
I think he was growing a zucchini, wasn't he?
He was growing vegetable marrows. That's what it was. Yes, I assume he was essentially growing a zucchini. I believe, though, again, I'm never going to assume that I know anything about English or British culture after the great Hundreds and Thousands debacle. I believe that Halloween in the UK has gotten more similar to the way we celebrate it in the US in the last 10 to 20 years, like fairly recently, actually. And, a lot of kids actually do now go trick-or-treating, and they wear costumes, and they do all this on the 31st of October. But even so, that it's still a bigger deal in the US. And part of the reason, interestingly, is that there is, of course, a holiday in the UK just a few days after Halloween that involves costumes and parades and bonfires. And that would be Guy Fawkes Day on the 5th of November. Remember. We don't have that, obviously. So I feel like we blow it all on Halloween. It feels, though, like Guy Fawkes Day is in a bit of decline, whereas Halloween is on the rise in the UK, and that might even be a little controversial because it's perceived by some as sort of the unwelcome encroachment of American culture. Again, I'm not going to speak for all of you. I would, in fact, encourage all of you to tweet directly at Catherine about this.
Oh, thank you so much, because I actually kind of would disagree a little bit with Kemper on this, but yeah, please let me be the one who takes the brunt of this. That's really great. Thanks.
I think it's up for debate. Hey, there are a lot of Americans who don't care about Halloween and who think it's annoying and don't do anything. And I'm sure there are people in the UK that do nothing for Halloween or that do a lot for,
Yeah, I live in a neighborhood that is heavily Orthodox Jewish. So I don't get trick-or-treaters, but what we do get is we get Purim. So the entire neighborhood, it's like, in the springtime, you get basically kids dressed up and the sort of equivalent of Halloween parties, and it's for Purim. It's kind of this odd flip because it's the wrong time of the year, but that's always what I see. So it becomes this very odd thing. I think that, I don't know if about you, Kemper, but in my early 20s, certainly, I was very committed to Halloween parties.
Which were nothing like the childlike Halloween party that's depicted in this book.
No, but I elaborately dressed up.
Americans get very into the costumery of it all, I think. And especially in your 20s, it's a good excuse to have a debauched night out. You know, you can have a lot of fun that way. So I think that's true.
Do you know what my best one was?
What?
It was the year that Bob Dylan movie came out, and I went as Cate Blanchett as Bob Dylan. I had a really short bob at the time, like a French bob. And
you put the bob in your bob?
I did. I put the bob in my bob. I had a harmonica around my neck. I wore sunglasses at night.
Was that I'm Not There?
Yeah, I'm Not There. Yeah. People kept wanting to take pictures with me. And I was like, yes, I have scored so hard.
It's a good point about your neighborhood, because it really does come down to neighborhoods. I mean, for the last couple of years, I actually have been going to a friend up in Silver Lake who happens to be in an area where the people who live in the area are all very active in terms of trick-or-treating. And then because the area has gained this reputation, people actually get bussed and driven into the neighborhood to trick-or-treat. And the first year that we went, I remember this friend was like, oh, it's going to be like really insane. I have thousands of people who come. And I was like, oh, well, obviously he's exaggerating. And he means, like 100 or maybe like 300 at most. He was not exaggerating. It was literally thousands of children just being overrun nonstop for about 6 hours. We bought 2 of those huge kind of Costco massive sized candy bags. And I was like, oh, this is probably overkill. Maybe we should get 1. I think we probably went through 20 of them, like while I was there, and I wasn't even there for the whole night. So it really depends. I think that I probably know what you're talking about. I went one year as Anna Karenina after being run over by the train. I had tape tracks up my back. I bought a name tag that said, hello, my name is Anna Karenina, that I put on my bustier. And we got trapped there because there were so many people in the neighborhood, and there was no way to get a cab or anything back because it was insane. It was an insane number of people. Yeah, it's a feeding frenzy, like literally, because people are feeding on candy. It's interesting. And it's actually kind of fun. So I actually mean this quite seriously. I find the differences in celebrating Halloween to be kind of interesting in terms of where people are in the world, where they find themselves in the world. So share with us. I mean, let us know on social media, or you can email. I will be reading the emails. Catherine does not have to bear the entire burden of this. I would love to hear from you at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. By the way, I was super tickled to learn that apparently there are Halloween crackers in the UK. So they're vampire and mummy themed variations on the Christmas crackers that Brits have.
That's very delightful.
Isn't that delightful? I mean, the Christmas cracker thing, by the way, you in the UK are probably rolling your eyes right now. I just find it still to be the loveliest, most like exotic thing that happens on Christmas, like that and the paper crowns. I've never done it, and I kind of just want to do it, but I feel like I would be cosplaying because it's just not my tradition. So yeah, let us know. And again, as we mentioned, my recounting was very much an Anglophone one, but obviously Halloween is celebrated all over the world. I mean, it's part of actually what I love about the holiday. So it's not every day that we get to have an Agatha Christie holiday themed novel at the exact right moment for us to have an extended discussion about said holiday. So I just really wanted to take that opportunity up front, with apologies for the fact that we are now many, many minutes into this episode and we have not even started to discuss the story
and yet, we should also mention the dedication, because it's dedicated to P.G. Wodehouse. I think that's a really interesting thing. It's when we have previously noted his great affection for her.
Yeah.
And so I think it's funny that this novel is dedicated to him.
Well, I also think it's funny that she dedicates the novel to him. She says, to P.G. Wodehouse, whose books and stories have brightened my life for many years. Also, to show my pleasure in his having been kind enough to tell me that he enjoys my books, and the my is italicized. Mm-hmm. It is such a humble brag of a dedication. I'm sorry.
It is.
I love you, Agatha. And actually, I love you even more because you know what? At this point, she's almost 80 years old. She doesn't really have to pretend. She's just like, you know what? I just want you all to know, P.G. Wodehouse, do you love him? Well, guess what? He loves me too.
No, I mean, we mentioned this actually in our Christie festival episode that, I think the appreciation of Christie amongst male British novelists was pretty high. Like the esteem was pretty high.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and they really did have a lifelong regard for each other. And actually, Woodhouse, obviously an English writer who very famously, in some ways infamously, relocated to the US. So in some ways also kind of appropriate for this book. But I think she just dedicated it to him because she wanted to dedicate one of them to him at some point. And this ended up being the one. It's actually also really interesting. She sent a copy of this book to Lord Mountbatten when it came out because he wrote a letter to congratulate her on the Mousetrap's 17th birthday as a West End production. FYI, it's about to have its 69th birthday this November, and I am sure it will have its 70th birthday next year. We're totally treating the COVID interregnum like it never happened because COVID deserves no better from us. So for all intents and purposes, it has been running from 1952.
Are we calling COVID an interregnum?
Well, I'm calling when they had to stop running plays an interregnum, a very unwelcome one at that. But yeah, I mean, it reopened in May of this year and it's been running ever since. In the letter, though, to Lord Mountbatten, she referred to this book as, quote, not as good as Roger Ackroyd, but not too bad. Fast forward if you haven't read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd or even The Man in the Brown Suit. But, Lord Mountbatten very famously suggested the narrator as murderer motif to Christie. And then she used it in Roger Ackroyd, although maybe her brother-in-law suggested it. And she also kind of sort of used it before in The Man in the Brown Suit. So that's all a bit complicated. And you can listen back to our previous episodes in which we talk all about that. The only other thing I want to mention before I promise we will actually get to the story, as to publication history, as we know from John Curran, Christie was notoriously hard to pin down as to dates. Most of the notes in her notebooks are just totally undated or they're very confusingly dated. But happily, as Curran puts it, the notes for Halloween Party provide the clearest example in the whole of the notebooks of a definite starting and finishing date for a title. The first page of Notebook 16 with the notes for Halloween Party is headed January 1st, 1969. And 45 pages later, we read July 7th, Halloween Party completed. And then she writes a note about sending a bunch of chapters to her agents and having her typist, Mrs. Jolly, transcribe dictaphone rolls 1 to 9. Shudder. But this is also just Curran had this note about the 6-month time span, which made me very depressed. He says, at this time, Agatha Christie was 78, and although 6 months for a full-length novel was not unreasonable, it is a long way from the 1930s and 1940s when she finished 2 or 3 novels a year. That just makes me feel really bad about my own productivity. So I'm just going to take that up with my therapist. Let's just continue on with the episode. It's like, she took 6 months to write a book at 78. What a slacker. Like the relativity of the statement becomes absurd. Her brain was so fast when she was in her heyday that it's just funny that 6 months to write a book is noted as being slow when she is 78 years old. He's not wrong. Like he's not out of line. He's totally right. It's just crazy. I mean, we should all just appreciate the fecundity.
Fecundity is not a word that I enjoy, but we'll use it here. And that note, I think that we should get into the victims.
I think we should.
Because I think that I'm currently one of them.
All right, Catherine, who are our victims in Halloween Party?
All right. So we have Joyce Reynolds, who's our ostensibly victim number 1. Let's just say it's not going to actually end up being that case. But she's a 13-year-old compulsive liar who is drowned in the apple bobbing barrel at the Halloween party.
Next up, we have Leopold Reynolds, who is Joyce's 10-year-old brother, who is apparently a rampant blackmailer and who was also drowned, not in an apple bobbing barrel, but in a river. The depiction of children in this book is very strange. And let's just say that the Reynolds children are not depicted too well. They're pretty terrible. Mm-hmm. And it's a very, very odd depiction, especially, I think, for a contemporary reader in 2021.
Agreed. You kind of just wonder, like, what were the parents doing? And then the older sister, we're not really going to get to her, but Anne, who's the smart one, apparently also is not very nice.
Yeah, there's a 16-year-old Anne Reynolds, and she barely ever figures into this, but I feel for her. The entire depiction of the Reynolds family is bizarre because they never seem real. And that is, I think, unusual for Christie, actually.
Mm-hmm. I think so too.
And it's not a positive attribute of this book by any means.
No. So we have Olga Simonov, who's an au pair from Herzegovina, who worked for one Mrs. Llewellyn Smith. So if that isn't a word pile for you, Mrs. Llewellyn Smith is apparently deceased from natural causes, but we will find out later that Olga was knifed to death, and that is a large spoiler. Apologies, but we only actually find that out at the almost end of the book.
Right. She's missing, right? She just disappeared a number of years ago. She's actually referred to, I believe, by Ariadne Oliver as a disappearess, which is not a word I had ever heard before. And I guess it takes one to know one, right? With Christie.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And by the way, I believe it was Herzegovina, which is almost Herzegovina. And then really, really oddly, in her notes, in those well-organized for once notes in Notebook 16, she actually refers to Herzegovina. So for whatever reason, I think maybe her publishers thought that Herzegovina sounded too similar to Czechoslovakia. Prague Spring had happened, although we also had the same thing in Third Girl, which was pre-Prague Spring. So, right. But maybe Czechoslovakia was, even with communist takeover, was a little bit more in the news, so that Herzegovina just wasn't going to fly in the way that it did in her earlier titles. That's my conspiracy theory, because it irks me to no end that we don't just get Herzegovina like we used to. I chose
to believe it was a typo, which is why I said that, because it's like
the
one letter
Herzegovina versus Herzegovina. I know it's all a bit irritating.
Yeah.
Last, in terms of victims, we have a Leslie Ferrier, who is a sleazy solicitor's clerk. And he too is knifed to death before the story begins. We are told that, perhaps it was some sort of a mugging gone wrong or something, but I don't know. Right. Maybe there will be more to that.
So then suspects, because boy, we got a list here. We have
everyone in Woodley Common, right?
Definitely everyone in Woodley Common, which is the village here. But we have Rowena Drake, who is the hostess of the titular Halloween party. She's a widow.
Then we have Judith Butler. No, not that Judith Butler.
That'd be more exciting, though. I really wanted it to be that Judith Butler.
For those who aren't familiar, Catherine, who do you mean by that Judith Butler?
Judith Butler, the incredibly famous gender theorist.
Who, maybe we could have used her actually to parse some of the goings on in this very novel.
Later.
But yeah, Judith Butler is a local woman who lives in Woodley Common, and she is actually friends with Ariadne Oliver.
From a cruise ship.
They met on a cruise, yes.
We have Miss Emlyn, who's the local headmistress at the Elms.
We have Miss Whitaker, who is a maths teacher at the Elms.
We have Miranda Butler, who is Judith's daughter, and she's very, very bright. And let's just say that she's a bit of an observer. Might come into play.
Indeed. Then we have Michael Garfield, a local landscape architect, incredibly beautiful. We are told many, many a time.
Oh, he is just so beautiful. I'm imagining an older, like Timothée Chalamet.
We actually get like a lot of allusions to the labors of Hercules in this book. Mm-hmm. And This one was unspoken, but I was feeling some Arcadian deer actually, because that's the one where Poirot is struck by male beauty. And we have a similar sequence here when he first sees Michael Garfield. So he was a local landscape architect. He designed this massive wild garden in a space that used to be a quarry, like a stone quarry. He did that for the late Mrs. Llewellyn Smith. And we'll be hearing a bit more from him, I believe.
Yeah. And then we have Mrs. Goodbuddy, who is one of the local cleaning ladies. She also plays fake witch for events.
And like maybe she's kind of a real witch too. We get a little taste of that pale horse business of every village needs its own witch. Never know with her. Then we have Harriet Lehman, who's a local cleaning lady. She cleaned for the late Mrs. Llewellyn Smith, and she apparently witnessed a codicil to Mrs. Llewellyn Smith's will.
Then we have Elsbeth McKay, who is, wait for it, Superintendent Spence's sister.
He's back.
He's back. And she's not really a suspect, but at the same time, she's lived in this village her whole life and she knows everybody here. So like, hey, why not?
Shades of Caroline Shepard, speaking of the murder of Roger Ackroyd. And another one of those elderly brother-sister pairs, right? Christie really likes to use them. Then we have possibly my two favorite characters in the whole novel. Nicholas Ransom and Desmond Holland. Nicholas is 18 years old and Desmond is 16 years old. They're both very hep cats in this swinging 60s.
They wear like a lot of like pink velvet.
They actually really do. I always have to give Christie credit for excellent physical descriptions when she does them, because we sometimes make fun of her for not doing it so well. And this one is legitimately amazing. It's really good. This is how she describes the two. Nicholas, the 18-year-old, was good looking, wearing sideburns, hair that grew fairly far down his neck, and a rather funereal outfit of black. Not as a mourning for the recent tragedy, but what was obviously his personal taste in modern clothes. The younger one was wearing a rose-colored velvet coat, mauve trousers, and a kind of frilled shirting. They both obviously spent a good deal of money on their clothes, which were certainly not purchased locally and were probably paid for by themselves and not by their parents or guardians. Desmond's hair was ginger colored and there was a good deal of fluffy profusion about it. I can totally see them. That is a great description. I totally get who they are.
I feel like Nicholas and Desmond were huge fans of the Rolling Stones.
Huge fans of the Rolling Stones. It's funny that you mentioned the Rolling Stones, because when she's describing the beauty of Michael Garfield, she contrasts it with the craggy faces and wild, greasy hair and irregular features of men who are considered attractive in this day and age. And I was thinking to myself, and as I read that, I was like, I'm pretty sure she's thinking of Richard Burton and Mick Jagger as the contrast. And hey, we're in 1969. I mean, we really are in the late 60s, and it does feel it to a certain extent in this book. So who knew that Mick Jagger would leave an imprint on an Agatha Christie novel?
Oh, I think everybody had a friend in college who was in a band, or at least I certainly did, who wore a pink blazer and had Mick Jaggery hair. And that was so many years later. And so I could just totally, not only could I picture these two, I could smell them.
They definitely smell of dirty laundry.
100%. There's no question.
With probably a little bit of BO underneath. Let's be honest.
Let's be honest. Again, went to college with some of these people. Not a little bit.
Indeed. Well, we will be hearing much more from Nicholas and Desmond as we get into the world as it appears to be. Take it away, Catherine Brobeck.
Ariadne Oliver is staying with Judith Butler, again, not that one, during Halloween. And perhaps because of her love of writing mysteries and her equal love of eating apples, as we know from every encounter we've ever had from her, she's been recruited to help with the local 11 plus fete for Halloween, which is to be hosted by Rowena Drake, who, as we said before, is this recent widow.
An officious presence within the village. It's because we just reread it, but I got major shades of Emily Inglethorpe in that she's the kind of person who does her duty and everyone relies on her, but no one really likes her. That's Rowena Drake. So we know that Rowena's husband contracted polio. He was in a wheelchair in the last years of his life. He recently passed away. So he was the nephew of Mrs. Llewellyn Smith, who was this, very wealthy older lady who has passed away before the book begins, and from whom Rowena inherited quite a bit of money, albeit only after a considerable amount of drama involving a forged will. All very Agatha Christie, isn't it?
Very Agatha Christie. And so Mrs. Drake, Rowena, had to involve both her and Mrs. Llewellyn Smith's attorneys in the forged will incident, because it was fairly clear that the will, or the codicil rather, to the will was not in her handwriting, but it seemed to have been forged by the late woman's au pair, Olga, who then supposedly ran off to some Greek isle or such. Nobody is clear on what happened.
Right. She just disappeared. Again, the disappearance. No one knows where she went. By the way, I mean, we're front loading this backstory. We don't really get that backstory right away. The book
we get it in parts through the entirety of the book, though.
We do. It's actually interspersed pretty well throughout the book. This is by no means a perfect book, but I think some of the awkwardness of construction that we see in some of these late career Christies, such as The Clocks, such as Third Girl, just to pick out our recent Poirots, I think that it's a bit smoother and more coherent in this book. That's not to say that we are anywhere near the level of a mid-career or an early career Christie. We're not, just to be clear. But I think that this book functions much better than either of those two recent Poirots, and I appreciated that. And I think we get this backstory out eventually in bits and pieces. And the book actually opens up, as almost all Christies do, extremely well, right? Which is that Ariadne Oliver is at this party. It's very easy to imagine the party and the preparations for the party as they're happening. She's very evocative about people hanging things up and talking about witches' balls and pumpkins, and they're going to do a broomstick competition. And is this the right bucket for the apple bobbing? Or no, we should use this other bucket. That one will be heavier. And where should it go? Put it in the library because no one cares about the carpet getting wet there. Blah, blah, blah. There's just, it's all very well rendered, I think. And it's also funny because Ariadne Oliver is a total garbage guest and she's doing nothing. Like all she's doing is prattling on about pumpkins in the US and eating apples and sitting on a settee. Like that's all she's doing, which is pretty funny. What she's also doing is having bits of conversation with some of the children. And this one child, Joyce, asks her about, the fact that she writes books. And she tells Mrs. Oliver and everyone within hearing distance, which is everyone who's there, that, she actually witnessed a murder once. And she's more or less bragging about it because that's her thing. Apparently she's a braggart and also a liar. And that's why no one believes her. Everyone's like, Joyce, shut up. Like you're such a liar. You're so tiresome. Like, just stop. And she starts getting really insistent about it. She's like, no, I did. And people are like, well, if you saw a murder, why did you never report it? And she's like, well, I didn't know it was a murder at the time that I saw it. It was only after that I realized it was a murder. And
there's also some very unnice things said about Joyce's appearance.
Yeah,
That's not helpful in this. Joyce basically seems like a very unpleasant, very unattractive, very obnoxious, lying teenager.
Well, what's interesting is that, and fast forward if you haven't read Dead Man's Folly, but you can't help reading this book and thinking about Marlene, right? The child victim in Dead Man's Folly. And I found that her appearance was handled a bit more brutally because I think it was outright stated, well, we know that nothing sexual could have happened to Marlene because look at her. I mean, that is basically what the characters say in the book. It's awful. And in this one, it's interesting. I mean, after the fact, after Joyce has been found dead and Ariadne Oliver is talking to Poirot, she says that Joyce was lumpy, but Poirot says, well, do you mean sexy? And she's like, yeah, I guess I do, but nothing sexual happened. So it's a little unclear. I don't think they're quite as cruel about her appearance as they were with Marlene. It's more her personality. Everyone just hated her. They all thought she was a bore and no one seemed to have much time for her, including her mother and her brother. So it's just bizarre. It's very bizarre handling of a victim, especially a 13-year-old victim.
Nobody knows her age, which is also a weird thing with a murder victim.
Yeah, they're all like, oh, she's like 12 or 13 or 14. I mean, she is 13, like I believe that is stated, but it actually is a little hard to figure out how old she is, right?
Because everybody keeps just naming her another age. So
I know.
She's drowned in the galvanized bucket for bobbing, what we said earlier.
That does happen later. I mean, she brags about having seen a murder at the preparations for the party. And then, a number of hours later, the party happens in that same space. And we're brought through all of the events. I mean, it's funny. We have a longtime listener who actually wrote to me once and said that she once hosted a Halloween party where they played every single game that is mentioned at the Halloween party at the beginning of this book, including Snapdragon, which sounds like it was by far the most fun game where you're
setting stuff on fire.
Yeah, like lighting raisins on fire and like soaking them in rum and trying to grab them, which is interesting. And that's a very noisy game, which is why they think that's when Joyce was killed and she was lured back to the apple bobbing tank.
Which is weirdly enough in the library, which I have to be honest, they do it in the library because the carpeting is bad in there.
I know. I'm like, so you don't mind the carpeting getting like moldy and musty? Why don't you just do it somewhere where there is no carpeting?
I know. And also, why would you do it surrounded by books in the library if you're going to get water everywhere? Like, it doesn't make any sense at all.
It makes me wonder about Rowena Drake's housekeeping, is all I have to say.
Well,
but yeah.
Maybe that is actually a clue that we should have added in. Spoiler alert, folks.
But yeah, I mean, by the end of this party, this rather exhausting party with lots of different events. My favorite one, by the way, was the girls looking in a mirror and seeing their husbands' faces, which actually Nicholas and Desmond are the ones who doctored photographs by like putting on all sorts of disguises.
Oh, they not only doctored photographs, they were like switching facial hair behind the scenes so that they could appear in the mirrors too.
And they're talking about like some pop star named Eddie Presswaite, who I don't believe is a real star, but it's all very Beatles. It's like these teenage girls oohing and eyeing over long-haired boys who look like the Beatles. And again, we are really in 1969. But yeah, unfortunately, someone held Joyce's head down in a galvanized bucket bobbing for apples, and they killed her. And true story, I actually remember reading this book when I was about 12 or 13. So I was literally Joyce's age. This book actually scared me. This is the only Christie that I ever read that upset me on a sort of emotional level. That wasn't just sort of a fun exercise.
Did you ever go bobbing for apples?
I'd never have bobbed for apples.
I think I went bobbing for apples probably maybe third grade or something. And I was like horrified.
This might be her most horrific murder, actually. I mean, it's awful. If you sit down and think about what happened in that library, it's really, really terrifying.
Yeah, I don't know that's her most horrific, but I mean, you have a child murder in something that's supposed to be fun. That in itself is horrifying. And what you gather from this is that whoever was in there, she must have trusted. So that is horrifying.
It's a horrible way to die for a 13-year-old. Goes without saying. We don't need to dwell on it because Christie definitely does not dwell on it.
No, not at all, in fact. Not at all.
I'll just say this. I found myself contrasting the handling of the Reynolds family and just the lack of mourning over Joyce and then her brother as well, her even younger brother in the story, to be such an anomaly within the Christie oeuvre, because I think that a lot of people who are more casual fans of Christie think that's what it's always like. They think that Halloween Party is actually pretty typical and that people don't really care because this is all just an exercise in the puzzle, right, of someone getting murdered, and it's not actually real humans, it's cardboard characters. That's just not true. Like, that's not actually, she's usually so adept, I think, at giving us enough of a sense of loss and grief while still having her fun, having her cake and eating it too. And it's just not here. And I think it's a big reason why this book doesn't work as well. And I found myself thinking about Peril at End House, actually. I actually went back into the book to make sure that I wasn't remembering this moment with rose-colored glasses. But like, we get an extended sequence where Poirot and Hastings sit down and they talk with, fast forward if you haven't read Peril at End House, but they talk with Maggie's parents. And Maggie's not a child, but she's young. She's like 18 or like 17 maybe. And they're just sad. They're devastated and they're bewildered. And she doesn't overdo it. And it's only a couple of pages, but you need it. And it's part of why that book works. And I remember finishing that book and thinking about Maggie's parents. And it's like, we just don't have that here. We have a couple of scenes with Mrs. Reynolds, but they're dead. The scenes are devoid of emotion. And it's very bizarre. It also gets better right after Joyce dies, because who enters the scene, Catherine?
Poirot. Because who does Mrs. Oliver go to? She goes to Poirot. She thinks something is awry. She thinks it's not being investigated properly. And she convinces Poirot, who immediately believes her, because we know that he believes her intuition, even if she's a little daffy. And so he ends up going to the village to investigate, and he calls up. Who does he call up? He calls up Superintendent Spence, his old pal.
taken at the flood, and Mrs. McGinty's dead. And boy, do they reminisce for a while.
Oh, Mrs. McGinty's dead comes up at great length, actually.
Yeah, it's a little unnecessary.
Yeah. And so he finds out that there's been a few recent murders. Because here's the question. It's like, did Joyce actually see a murder? And if she's 13, it would have had to have been in the last few years. And it turns out the village has a few people. It has a school teacher who was strangled to death. It has a teenager who was bashed over the head. Leslie Ferrier was knifed. Olga Semnoff is missing. But there's nothing obvious that she would have seen.
I mean, what's interesting is that this book then becomes another exercise in looking up crimes of the past, which is exactly what we had in By the Pricking of My Thumbs, which was our previous mystery. And it's actually also very much what we get in future books later in her career. I mean, Christie, as we've mentioned, she was nearly 80. She was looking back a lot herself. I think even at Bertram's Hotel and Third Girl, it's not necessarily past crimes, but they're very retrospective in tone. That's fine, but there was something about the pattern of it being exactly the same as By the Pricking of My Thumbs. I mean, I think she handles it a lot better. This book is a lot tighter than By the Pricking of My Thumbs, but I was a little weary of okay, now we're going to look into a whole series of past crimes motif. A little wearier than I would have been otherwise, I think.
Well, and I think that also because a lot of them don't matter. So it gets exhausting really quickly, I would say.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a dragging the marsh, if you will, a saggy middle, I'd say, in this book. But what Poirot does discover, which is of importance, is that Miranda, Judith's daughter, she was not at the party. She was actually sick. So she did not attend the preparations for the party. She did not attend the party itself. And she's a slightly odd and precocious child. I rolled my eyes a little bit at her choice of name. We get it. We've all read The Tempest or seen The Tempest.
She's also directly mentioned in the text.
She's the innocent, right? Like she's this special, untouched kind of
brave new world
spirit. Yeah, there's a lot of whimsy about her. I mean, this is the very uneven treatment of children in this book. We either have garbage children like Joyce or golden children like Miranda, and both depictions made me very uncomfortable. There's a regard for Miranda, even just physically, in this book that is a little yucky, I thought, because she's a child. It's interesting.
She's a woodland nymph.
Oof, boy. Okay, so we discover that Miranda, the woodland nymph, likes sitting in trees. She likes watching nature. She likes watching people. She particularly likes doing this in and around the Quarry Garden, where she also likes chatting with the beautiful Michael Garfield. And essentially, yada, yada, yada. This is, again, the saggy middle of the story where we hear the same thing about how Joyce is a compulsive liar from basically every single person. We also hear a recounting from the party on the part of Miss Whitaker, who, again, is the maths teacher. And she saw Rowena Drake in the hall standing on the stairwell in her house. And she seemed to see something or someone perhaps coming out of the library. And in her surprise, she dropped this huge vase on herself. She sort of tipped it over onto herself so that she was completely soaked in the water that was in the vase. And then she dropped the vase and it actually broke into pieces in the hall and they had to clean it up. And it was all a bit of a scene. So we learned that. Then we also learned that Leopold, Joyce's little brother, 11 years old, I believe.
Maybe 10.
Maybe 10. Again, fuzzy. He's 10 or 11. He is also found drowned, except in a local brook. And he is a blackmailer. And, I'm jumping ahead for a second, but I just have to pull out what Poirot says about Leopold, because it is so brutal and so bizarre. And again, it just speaks to the odd depiction of children in this book. He was clever enough, astute enough to know he was taking a risk, but he wanted the money. He was 10 years old, but cause and effect is much the same at that age as it would be at 30 or 50 or 90. Is it? I think I might be a little more forgiving of a 10-year-old who's blackmailing someone as I would a 30-year-old.
Well, also, wouldn't you just tell the kid to shut up? No offense to children, but a 10-year-old, it's insane to me. And also he's doing it to buy science supplies.
There are several unanswered questions or badly answered questions that we're left with at the end of this novel. And one of them is, why is Leopold, who seems to be a too clever for his own good child, why is he stupid enough to blackmail someone who he literally knows at this point has killed two people, one of them being his big sister?
Also, why didn't he go to the police?
Yeah, it's a little absurd, or maybe a lot absurd. But yeah, so Leopold is dead. And then what happens, Catherine?
So Mrs. Lehman, who we mentioned earlier, who is one of the two of the town's cleaners, she goes to Mrs. Oliver because she trusts Mrs. Oliver. She thinks Mrs. Oliver is going to listen to her. She tells Mrs. Oliver that, actually, fun fact, she was the witness who signed the will of Mrs. Llewellyn Smith, or the codicil, rather, and had seen her stuff it into a book, and that she knew that the will that Mrs. Llewellyn Smith had written and had witnessed had left everything to Olga. But at the same time, Mrs. Llewellyn Smith was super fickle and was probably just mad at Mr. Drake and Rowena at the time.
Yeah, it's all very weird because she's coming to Mrs. Oliver with this new information, but she had it all the time.
I know.
And I guess she's just realizing, because of everything that's going on, that maybe it's important. And this is another unanswered question that we're left with at the end of the novel. Why, if Mrs. Llewellyn Smith went to the trouble of signing a codicil that was altering her will, why, after writing it out and then getting it witnessed properly, did she hide it in a book and never reference it again so that no one would know about it? Doesn't make sense.
No, it doesn't. I think the closest answer you can get is that she was debating on whether or not she wanted to give it to her lawyers. That's not actually stated, but that's the closest answer you could get.
Right. So it's like maybe she had second thoughts about it. And so she was, but we kind of know by the end of the book that she didn't, but maybe she did. It's all very confusing. And this is awkward. I mean, this is where the backstory, the past crimes business
doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
It does. It's just awkwardly connected, I think, to the present day intrigue. Poirot, soon after hearing this, he's in Woodley Common. He's doing his mainly armchair, yet a little bit of getting out of the armchair investigative thing, which he does when he goes into small towns like this. I do like that setup of Poirot in a village. It's fun. He tells Mrs. Oliver to get Judith Butler and her daughter Miranda out of Dodge ASAP. He's like, do not let them out of your sight. They are in danger. You need to go, go, go. Mrs. Oliver, to give her credit, she really does follow his directions and she does get them out of there.
Yeah, she does it really straightforwardly too. She makes up an excuse very quickly to Judith. She legitimately listens to what Poirot is telling her to do.
Indeed. Unfortunately, Judith is kind of we have garbage children in this book. We also have a garbage mother, because it's actually a really funny moment. Judith is like, oh, well, I don't really want to take Miranda, so I'm just going to leave her at the Reynoldses. And Mrs. Oliver is like, are you kidding me? 2 out of 3 of their children have been murdered. You're going to leave your daughter there? And the other person she suggests leaving her with is Rowena Drake, which will be interesting in a second. And it's just like, oh boy, Miranda, your mom, maybe not so much on the ball. Again, if it were the other Judith Butler, I think she'd be, Miranda.
Oh, Judith, other Judith Butler also would have seen through what all of this was, by the way.
So more on kind of the garbage mom perspective, we have Judith and Ariadne Oliver leaving with Miranda, and they stop at a restaurant, and Miranda's like, I'm going to go to the bathroom. And they're like, okay. And then they're like talking about what food they're going to get. And then they're like, where's Miranda? And we discover that she totally pulled a runner. She left the bathroom and she got in a car with a mystery person.
This is where this book becomes the biggest problem to me, because the narrative switch is so weird.
It's very clunky.
Yeah. She's in a car with a mystery person who takes her to an ancient sacrifice site, hands her a golden goblet, and she's about to drink from it when it's taken from her by, who is it taken from? Kemper.
I love this moment because it's so cartoony, actually. The mystery person, who we're not going to reveal quite yet, says, drink to beauty, Miranda. And then the voice yells out, like hell she does. And Nicholas and Desmond come busting out and they knock the cup away and they save Miranda. And I actually appreciate the fact that these are two youths of the 60s who look as ridiculous as all of Christie's youths of the 60s do. But unlike the majority of these kids who she's created, they're actually good at heart. They end up being the heroes.
Poirot has previously, before this, gone to Miss Emlyn, the headmistress, and asked about the boys.
Oh, well, do you remember what she says? Because I thought that was really funny, too. She essentially tells him that they're good, but the way she says it is they are sound as an apple without maggots in it, which in this book is as good as it gets, like, i.e. an absence of maggots.
Yeah. So we know that they've been confirmed because Miss Emlyn is a pretty harsh judge of people. And so we know that if she's vouching for them. And so what we're missing here is that clearly Poirot sent them after her.
This is actually, a rare instance. We talk about Miss Marple laying traps, but he didn't really lay a trap because he didn't want Miranda to be put in danger like this. If Judith Butler had actually kept her eye on her daughter, this never would have happened. But he was ensuring that she would be safe, even despite her mother's ineptitude. So.
Right. He did a backup. So he sent Mrs. Oliver to take care of them, and then he sent a backup.
So as we get into our clues, bridging on over into the world as it actually is, we're not really sure what is happening, right? And unfortunately, this is not a straightforward puzzle mystery. It really is impossible, I think, to use clues to figure out exactly what's going on.
You can pretty much guess what's going on here pretty easily, but I don't think this book is playing fair.
No, I don't think it is either. And this isn't one of Christie's classic puzzle mysteries where you really can go step by step by step. But there are a couple of moments that do have echoes of classic Christie clues, which I found very pleasing and satisfying. It reminded me actually of the clocks in that way, where we had a couple of echoes of classic Christie clues. And again, I think this book hangs together a lot better than the clocks, but it has that kind of sense of, oh yeah, this is Christie not at her best, doing a little bit of what she used to do, but not everything. What is the first clue, Catherine?
Water. You can't really drown someone, can you, Kemper, without getting wet yourself? I mean, I wouldn't know that from firsthand experience. Or would I? But who in the story gets extra wet at the party? I'd also say maybe a deduction here is that breaking a vase on yourself would make you extra wet.
Christie really plays fair because when Miss Whitaker is telling that story about Rowena Drake spilling the vase on herself, she says it was a clumsiness which I can assure you is not one of Mrs. Drake's characteristics. Fast forward if you haven't read The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, but this is her also, I think, being very clever with misdirection, because when she gives us this clue, she masks it by way of focusing our attention on, well, who was Mrs. Drake looking at coming out of the library? Because she's standing on the stairwell and she looks in this significant way. And that's very much what we had with Marina Gregg in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. And it was a ruse there too. It wasn't really what she was looking at. I mean, what she was looking at was actually relevant at least, but it ended up being what she was hearing that was actually important. And here it's the spilling of the water itself, not her looking at anything in particular. And the fact that the spilling of the water was witnessed by Miss Whitaker. She's in full view. So Mrs. Drake can point to someone who can explain why she is as wet as she is. That is all extremely suspicious and should be making us focus on Mrs. Drake as a possible suspect. But I think that's a really devious clue. I don't think a lot of people get there. So the second clue, of course, has to do with money and wills and inheritance. And this is so classic Christie. But we have all of these past crimes. And the one involving wills and codicil funny business is the one that is significant. And who is involved in that one? Rowena Drake. Interesting. And I think this is really clever, too, because what we essentially learned from Mrs. Lehman is that the forged codicil that's submitted to the lawyers is truly forged. Mm-hmm. But it's a forgery of a real codicil. So the forgery itself is a fake. It's a fake forgery. So that kind of extra level of subterfuge that the murderers are using here is also pretty devious and confusing in that classic Christie-ish way. And I appreciated that.
Yeah, it ends up being really convoluted, right? Because the codicil that Mrs. Lehman signs is actually the same codicil that is submitted to the attorneys, right? Mm-hmm. It's just that the one that's submitted to the attorneys is a clear forgery. And so even if you found the real codicil, what would you do with that? Because now there's a fake one. So it would revert back to the original will, right? It's an inheritance law question. And so the inheritance goes to Mr. Drake, but Mr. Drake has passed away. And I will say this is another loose end in this. We don't actually know if Mr. Drake died a natural death. It is not brought up whatsoever in this. It's left to the readers as a total mystery, but because Mr. Drake's inheritance goes entirely to Rowena, who inherits all of Mrs. Llewellyn-Smith's money and all of Mr. Drake's money? Well, it's Rowena.
That would be Rowena. She is the one who has the most to gain. Yeah, it is made explicit that she did, in fact, kill her husband in the adaptation, which we'll talk about. But yeah, it's totally a loose end. I mean, it really doesn't seem to be implied. I almost, if I had to guess, would say that she didn't.
I would have said she didn't too. In the text, it really doesn't seem like she did.
It doesn't seem like she did. I agree with that. We do have a final clue, which doesn't really get you to the solution, but I think it helps explicate or untangle a lot of the confusion here. I think this one's actually very clever too, because it has that sense of inevitability when you get to the other side of it, where you're like, oh my God, this is so obvious. How could I not have seen it? But it is, a conundrum throughout the story that, well, Joyce is a big old liar and she says she saw murder and no one believes her, but she did get murdered. So she must have seen a murder, right? And ultimately the answer is no, she didn't. She did lie. And I love that Christie is consistent with her character. And what's so obvious is, well, she made up this lie at the preparations for the party. There was only one person, one child who was not present at that party. And obviously she could not have made up the lie if the person who told her that they had seen a murder were there. So it has to be Miranda who actually saw a murder, because someone had to have seen a murder, since that's why Joyce got murdered. That's clever. I mean, it's so obvious. And then of course we also have all these clues layered in about Miranda being observant and being a watcher and, climbing up trees in the quarry and liking to listen to people and watch them. So of course, Miranda is the one who saw the murder. Another loose end, though, that's not tied up. Why did Miranda say anything the entire book?
Well, we'll get to why. But
was she under the influence, like the Celtic, ancient spiritual influence that whole time? No,
but I mean, she didn't know what she saw exactly, right?
But she did by the time she told Joyce about it, which was before the book started.
Right. But I mean, the problem was she saw two people who she really liked doing something that
one person she really liked.
One person that she really liked. And she second guessed herself because she's a child.
I suppose it's a little shaky.
Obviously, the murderer is Rowena, but it's way more complicated than that. And I would say that, again, what I said previously is I don't think this novel plays fair. I think you can pretty easily guess from the get-go who done it. But the resolution is like the last 25 pages or something of the novel. And it's literally all the information you should have had before. Rowena was having an affair with Michael Garfield, who wanted to build his masterpiece garden on a Greek island. And when her husband died, and there was this contested will that she had obviously arranged by replacing the codicil with a forgery by another guy she was probably sleeping with, which was Ferrier.
Not definitely, though, right? I don't think we know for sure that they were carrying on.
We don't for sure know that, but there's a hint of that. So she assures them that the original will stands. Everything would have gone to Mr. Drake, which means that when Mr. Drake died, everything would go to Rowena. And then Rowena and Michael could go buy a Greek island, which in fact Guess what? They did. There's the implication, right, that Michael and Rowena also have knifed Farrier.
Right, because he's the one who forged the codicil, so they needed to kill him so that he couldn't tell anyone about it.
And then they knife Olga in Michael's fancy quarry garden. And Miranda sees, although she's not certain what she has seen.
Well, because she sees them carrying her body, right? So she sees a limp body. She might see some blood or something. But, you know, this was a couple of years ago, right? So she was 9 or 10.
She was like 10. Yeah, right.
So she's just not sure what she's seeing. But she does see that it's Olga, and she sees Rowena and Michael carrying her.
And they dump Olga in a former wishing well. And then they seal it shut with concrete.
But crucially, they both think that someone was watching them at the time.
They do.
And it's actually Rowena who, you know, she senses someone is there, someone's watching us. And Miranda, you know, when she's telling the story, it's actually quite terrifying. You know, she freezes. And fortunately for her, in that moment, they go about their business of dumping Olga's body down a well. So they never find out who may have seen them, which is why when Joyce, at the preparations for this party in Rowena's house, says, "Oh, well, I actually saw a murder," Rowena freaks out because she doesn't know who might have seen, you know, who it might have been. But I'm sure she assumes it probably was a child, or else someone would have made them their presence known or informed the police. I would have to think that Rowena would wonder, why is she saying this right in front of me? If she saw me, you know, with a dead body, but who knows? Like, maybe she didn't get a good look at her, at Rowena, or it's fine. It actually does track. It makes sense that Miranda would tell Joyce. It makes sense that Joyce would boast about this, not knowing anything about who it actually was, because Miranda didn't give her those specifics, obviously, when Miranda was absent because she was sick in the moment. And it all really makes sense that then Rowena, within a couple of hours, on the fly, on the spur of the moment, would kill Joyce as she did, and then subsequently kill Joyce's brother when he tries to squeeze her for some more money. Michael was actually not there, right? He arrives at Woodley Common later the day or the next day, right? The day after Joyce is murdered. So that's why we think he can't even have anything to do with it. And this is, I think, an obfuscation Christie's used before, where it's a pair of murderers as opposed to just one murderer. That also adds to the complication here, but that's clever. And that all works. Rowena is the one who kills Joyce and Leopold. And then Michael is the one who realizes that, oh no, it's actually Miranda who saw. And then he starts getting very intimate with her, which sets us up for, oh boy, a final twist. And I would love to say that we've never seen this before in Christie, but we have.
Yeah,
many times. And we have a late breaking familial relation revelation here. What would that be, Catherine?
Miranda's his daughter.
Boo.
I know. It happens so close to the end of the book that you're just like, you got to be absolutely kidding that this is happening.
No, it's too much. It's too much. Yeah, Michael Garfield had a much earlier affair with Judith Butler. He's the one, obviously, who convinced Miranda to go with him and to be sacrificed. So Miranda's going to sacrifice herself because Michael and Rowena can't be caught. And she thinks that she should just sacrifice her own life because she's impressionable and she's a child.
Well, and she thinks that it's her fault that the other two kids have died.
Right. That's heartbreaking. And it's really awful what he does to her, that he allows her to think that and kind of confirm that guilty belief that she has.
Well, he's described repeatedly at the end of the book as Narcissus.
Right. He has no regard for anyone else, including Rowena. It's pretty cler he's just using her for her money and that he was going to get rid of her, however,
in Greece.
Yeah, in the most easy way he could dispense with her. So she probably wouldn't have been long for this world. And she's just infatuated with him because, again, he's super beautiful. There's just a through line of Michael's regard for Miranda that makes me so uncomfortable. And I don't even know if I'm more or less uncomfortable if he is aware that she's his daughter. But there's this moment where he's drawing her in the quarry garden, and he says exquisite. Within the text, it's noted that it's unclear if he's talking about the girl or the drawing, which would, all be very delightfully Emma-ish, but ew, it's gross. She's a child. And he's this man who's just sitting there drawing her and kind of fawning all over her. And it's really, really...
Well, and what does he label the drawing with?
Iphigenia.
Mm-hmm. Which, if none of you are up on your Greek literature, that would have been Agamemnon's sacrifice of his oldest daughter, right? And if you want to really go into this, it's what leads to Clytemnestra going berserk on Agamemnon and poor Cassandra, who did nothing wrong, and Clytemnestra's children in the Oresteia, because Agamemnon sacrificed the oldest daughter.
Right. And that would seem to indicate that he is aware.
Yeah, it would seem to definitely indicate it.
Which, I mean, again, just in that I was so uncomfortable with the sort of regard for her physicality, it almost in a weird way makes it less uncomfortable, but it's still just all sorts of horrible and inappropriate and just really, really upsetting, actually, when you think about what's being done to Miranda. And that's her book.
Yeah, and we don't even really know what happens to Rowena.
I guess she goes to jail.
Maybe, I guess. I don't know.
We know that Michael Garfield kills himself because he drinks the poison that he was going to force his daughter to drink. But yeah, Rowena, I assume, is going to spend the rest of her days in prison. I appreciate that Poirot in the end notes that the knife wounds in Olga Semenov's body match the knife wounds in Leslie Ferrier's. Yeah. So he does get his evidence, because Poirot really usually does get his evidence. He's not so much the springing traps a la Miss Marple type.
Right. And the boys clearly see Michael about to kill Miranda. So
it all kind of gets wrapped up, but we do have all those loose ends that we noted as we were summarizing. And it's not a high functioning Christie.
This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
Catherine, I was thinking recently about how, even though Halloween is a fun enough holiday, there's one thing about it that's inherently unfair.
Did your house get egged and toilet papered on Halloween during high school, Kemper?
Well, yes, it did, in fact, but that's not actually what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the unfairness of having to choose between a trick or a treat. Why cannot we have both, Catherine?
You do bring up a good point.
Especially since we have a perfectly legitimate and lovely way to ensure we never have to choose an online nirvana where both tricks and treats abound. I'm speaking, of course, of Best Fiends, where players get the treat of teaming up with their bestest of fiends.
Hi, Howie the Lizard.
And together, human and fiend get to figure their way through an endless array of devilish, ghoulish, fiendish tricks in puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. Wow! Truly the best of both worlds. So engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends.
Before we get into our ranking of this one, we should talk for a little bit about the one English language adaptation that we have for this book. And of course, that would be from the David Suchet series. This episode aired as the second episode of season/series 12. So that would be the second to last season. That was in July of 2011. And it's written by Mark Gatiss. So you know that there's going to be at least one good gay joke in here. That is what I said to myself as I saw his name appear. I was like, oh, goody. We're obviously big fans of his. And I think that a big problem with adapting this book for the Suchet series is that, of course, it has to take place in the 30s. And if Halloween parties were rare in the UK in the 60s, they really didn't exist in the UK in the 30s. But as Mark Aldrich points out in Agatha Christie on Screen, Gatiss sensibly ignores the fact that Halloween parties of the type described in the book were practically unknown in the UK in the pre-war period and continues with the mystery regardless. I do think that this disregard is why we get a rare continuity error in the episode, which amused me, which is that when Mrs. Goodbody shows up to the party as a witch, she's wearing green face makeup. And it was only when The Wizard of Oz came out in 1939 with Margaret Hamilton's terrifying turn as the Wicked Witch of the West, still gives me nightmares. Saw it recently, and it was more terrifying. It's actually scarier to watch as an adult.
Wait, did you let your daughter watch it?
No. She watched the tornado sequence, actually.
Oh, so she only saw black and white.
Well, because we actually did read, I did read The Wizard of Oz with my daughter, which is why I know that the Wicked Witch is, as depicted in the book, she doesn't have green skin. She almost looks like a corpse, actually. She's depicted in the book. She's very scary in the book, too. But we did read the book, and then we watched
Did you talk to her at great length about the gold standard?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. William Jennings Bryant. But so Margaret Hamilton very famously wore that green makeup, and then green skin came to be associated with witches. But obviously that's a bit of an anachronism in this episode. The one thing I want to point out from Poirot and Me, when David Suchet talks about this episode, he singles out an actor who I would not have singled out, and it is the one who plays the local solicitor. And this is what he says. The actor who gave me the greatest pleasure was the extraordinary comedian and comic writer Eric Sykes, who was there to play a local solicitor. Eric and I had met several years before when I made a documentary about the comedian Sid Field in the wake of the play I did about him in the West End, and I was thrilled to be with him again. At this point, he was 86 years old and was greeted with the most tremendous respect by his fellow members of the cast, as well as the crew. He gave a simply wonderful performance and very generously presented me with a copy of his autobiography at the end of filming. Typically self-effacing, his inscription said, "It's been a privilege and indeed an honor to work with a giant in the theater. With love, Eric. In fact, the privilege and honor was entirely mine." Such a mensch, that David Suchet. I just love him.
Yeah, that's lovely. Really lovely. I mean, obviously a bunch of characters are cut in the adaptation out of necessity. There's a lot of characters in this book.
Yeah, there's a lot of streamlining that's done, and I think it's better for that. I mean, one of the best things about this adaptation is that we have a bobbing for apples cam. When the faces go into the water, we see the faces. It's really horrifying. This is very much shot as a horror movie. We have a lot of jerky direction, and there's also a lot of weird flashbacks and even some jump cuts. You know, I appreciated the sort of horror-inspired directing. I did find it sometimes a little distracting for the series. It's kind of an odd duck of an episode. But I think especially for the penultimate season, some of these episodes got a little rough because we're now very much in the territory of, oh, right, we have to do X book, don't we? Because we're almost done. And I think there's a reason why they left Halloween Party to the second to last season. But I think that very much with Mark Gatiss's help, they acquitted themselves well.
Yeah, I think it works. There's some changes to the Mrs. Oliver plot line, which are a little odd, I think.
Like how she's sick half the time.
Yeah.
She's just like in bed, like sneezing and stuff. She has like a bad dream at one point and wakes up screaming. That was one of the moments where I was like, I get it. That's like a horror movie trope, but like Zoe Wanamaker screaming, shooting up out of bed like the Crypt Keeper. I don't know if I necessarily needed that. But I should mention that a rare character who was created for the adaptation would be Mrs. Drake's son and daughter. And there's a scene when Mrs. Drake's daughter is complaining about her name, which is Frances Drake.
I mean, fancy saddling your daughter with a name like Frances Drake.
I've told you 1,000 times. It's only ignorant people who make a joke.
But it's me who has to live with it. I've heard them all. Armada this, Game of Bowls that. I've even been begged to throw down my raincoat over a puddle for some queen or other. I forget his name.
And that is where we get our gay joke that we were implicitly promised, or at least that I was implicitly promised.
Well, and I mean, we should also, right. Well, and we should also mention that there is the gay element in the novel. It's a red herring clue. It's one of the earlier murders in the village. And it's also made more explicit in the adaptation.
I think it's so subtextual in the book that I'm not sure it's really there. And it's made very explicit in the adaptation, but handled very well. I mean, I think handled very respectfully, actually. There's a lesbian subplot, basically, in the adaptation.
I think it's in the book. I think that's how I read it. And I don't think it's like offensive in the book if you're reading it like that. But in the adaptation, yeah, I think it's actually handled well.
Well, and we do have a reference to lesbianism in the book, which we will get to when we're talking about our book-specific characters. Don't think I was going to let that one pass us by, Catherine. Before we get into our rankings, I do just want to mention that we do, of course, have a French language adaptation as part of the second iteration of Les Petits Meurtres d'Agatha Christie. This is my Halloween treat for you. This is my sweet treat for you. So that aired as the 5th episode in 2014. The title of that was Meurtre à la Kermesse, which I believe translates to murder at the fair, which is interesting. Can
you do one of those Gomez Adams things to Morticia where you're just holding my arm while you speak terrible French?
All right, let's move on to the rankings. I do want to start with John Curran's take because that is how I always start if I possibly can. This is what he had to say. Like many late titles, the book itself is diffuse and unfocused. There are some new ideas, as well as those from earlier titles, but there are also too many meandering conversations. The uneasy mix does not coalesce into a coherent and ingenious detective novel. Compare the setup with similar titles from earlier decades, Dumb Witness, Taken at the Flood, and Mrs. McGinty's Dead, where Poirot arrives in a small town to investigate a suspicious death, and we can appreciate the deterioration in the quality of the titles from Endless Night onwards. Apart from Passenger to Frankfurt, all of the titles after 1967 are journeys into the past, each one weaker than the previous, but they are all predicated on a compelling basic idea. I don't know if I necessarily agree that they get weaker as we go on. I'd have to think about that after we've covered all of them, but points taken, I think, for everything he's saying there.
I guess I would have a problem with even saying this is a journey into the past per se, though.
Well, it's just looking into past crimes, right? I mean, that's the preoccupation of the investigation in the novel, right? There's nothing to investigate as to Joyce and Leopold's deaths. Nothing.
Sure, but it's more or less like, what did you see? Even think about like, And Then There Were None and Five Little Pigs, which are obviously our top two novels. They're both about past crimes, right? Mm-hmm. But they're very directly about past crimes. Halloween Party is actually pretty much centered on something pretty current, I would say. And it's just a guessing game then.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe what you're getting at, although correct me if I'm mischaracterizing what you're saying, is that in something like Five Little Pigs, murder in retrospect, right? The idea of going back into the past to shed light on present day circumstances or how the past affects the present or what exactly happened. I mean, that is in an emotional and a connective way. That is the preoccupation of the novel. Whereas here, the past crimes are really just to try to figure out in a very mechanical way, like what is happening. Like there's no thematic resonance.
No, and I would say the same thing with And Then There Were None, right? Is that everybody who is brought to the island, they're brought there for a past crime.
Then, like, my God, there's thematic resonance, right?
Right.
It's true. I mean, she has often been obsessed with the idea of the past, right? And the past being brought to visit upon those in the present. But I think Curran's point, and probably your point too, is that these backward looking stories later in the career are not really doing it in a substantial or interesting way. And she had already done it. Like she had already done that. So I can't necessarily blame her. She'd written a lot of books by that point. So it begins to feel a little tired.
No, I think so. We get a lot of interviews with people who basically say, yeah, Joyce was an inveterate liar. Mm-hmm. And it's every chapter is like, oh yeah, Joyce is a huge liar. And then Poirot eventually says, literally, I kind of get it at this point. That's what the problem here is.
Well, that's the lack of focus and the repetition that we don't get in Tighter Christie, right? By the Pricking of My Thumbs was meandering and unfocused in that it was reams and reams of dialogue that didn't have much to do with anything. This doesn't have that as much, but it's people saying the same thing over and over again in the course of an investigation, which, to be fair, we have in a lot of mysteries that are not Christie's and even some earlier Christie's. So like, I didn't find this to be as frustrating of a read as I did By the Pricking of My Thumbs, or at least certain aspects of By the Pricking of My Thumbs and The Clocks and even Third Girl and even At Bertram's Hotel in some of those books, but it's just not tight. And you do still have that diffuse feeling
that you get in later Christie. I mean, I think the other issue is that this is a real retread of Dead Man's Folly. Fast forward if you haven't read Dead Man's Folly, but the Clocks, by the way, so fast forward if you haven't read the Clocks also, but the Clocks was already kind of a reworking of the puzzle that was at the center of Dead Man's Folly. This is how John Curran puts it. He's now talking about Dead Man's Folly and Halloween Party. In both, we have a child murdered during a game, witnesses to an earlier murder presenting a danger to a hitherto safe killer, and the creation of a thing of beauty as a grave, a folly in one novel and a garden in the other. And we give Christie points for recycling when she does it artfully, because boy, does she do it artfully and interestingly sometimes. That was half of our conversation about Endless Night. Right?
Mm-hmm.
That is not the case here. Like this very much feels like, oh boy, we've been here before. She's not recycling ingeniously as she often does, even though we do have those grace notes of Christie genius, right? The real codicil made to look like a forgery, the Miranda as witness clue since she wasn't at the party, the Rowena Drake making sure someone saw her get wet clue. Those are all great clues. They just don't, they don't make a full and complete and coherent puzzle mystery.
No, they don't. So where are you landing on plot mechanics?
I think that plot mechanics, because of that, it's not the lowest that we're ever going to go, but it's not great. To me, it feels middling, which is why a 5 feels right.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the credibility is much higher because I completely understand what's going on here, even if it's not necessarily executed in the best way.
I do too. Of course, that hastily revealed and hard to believe revelation as to familial relation is a big ding as to plot credibility, I think. But we've seen that a number of times, and I think much more egregiously. This really also isn't a spoiler, but the mirror cracked from side to side, 450 from Paddington. And of course, major shout out to Murder in Mesopotamia. I think it mars those books a lot more than this one. It's awful when it happens. You're like, oh God, why is this happening at the very end of the book? But it doesn't overwhelm the mystery the way that I think it does more so in those books. So I definitely think that plot credibility should be higher than plot mechanics.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. What was the number that you were thinking?
To be generous, I could go with a 6. But if we're feeling generous, I think we could give it a 7.
Maybe let's give it a 7. I mean, I really do actually buy that the characters would pull the thing that they do in this.
Yeah, it's bananas, but like I believe Rowena Drake. I actually think Rowena Drake and Michael Garfield are good characters, especially Rowena Drake. And I believe that they would have killed the 4, potentially 5 people that they killed. Pulling off this plot. And that's saying something for Christie, because this is a pretty cuckoo plot, but she pulls it off the way that she did in her best earlier books. So I think this is actually a category where we should give her credit. Before we get off of plot, I did just have to point out, and fast forward if you haven't read A Murder is Announced, but within like 2 lines of each other, it happens on page 200 in my copy, Christie has the word enquire with an E and then inquire with an I. Like within 2 lines of each other, spelled differently. One time it's the title of a book. And I just couldn't help wondering if that was a very inside reference to A Murder is Announced, where that's like a really important clue. I had to point that out for the other nerds out there who might have been having the same thought.
I did not have the same thought, Kemper. So,
or maybe I'm just alone.
But maybe somebody will. I'm going to hope that somebody out there shares that with you.
5 for plot mechanics, a 7 for plot credibility. Moving along to series-long characters. This is a fairly happy category. I think this is not the greatest Poirot. This is not the greatest Mrs. Oliver. Superintendent Spence, I think we've said enough about him with the sentence or 2 we devoted toward him. We're actually going to see him again, by the way, and Elephants Can Remember. We also, by the way, do technically...
Yes, I'm sure that will rank highly.
We do technically have a 4th series-long character since Mr. Goby makes a brief appearance, but we don't even see him in this book.
His one line.
Well, his exposition dump is virtual. It's just via correspondence as to Olga Semenov's whereabouts or lack thereof in her home country of Herzegovina.
Not Herzegovina.
I'm insisting on it. It's Herzegovina to me.
Okay.
The one exchange I wanted to highlight between Mrs. Oliver and Poirot that I found pretty delightful was this little bit about Poirot's shoes, because it really is the comedic high point of the novel. And I think it's very unsurprising that Mark Gatiss preserves this like almost verbatim, I think, in his adaptation, which I think was very smart, because it reads like old friends bickering, which is exactly what these two are at this point. So this is how it goes. You know, if you'll excuse me saying so, you oughtn't to wear patent leather shoes in the country. Why don't you get yourself a nice pair of suede shoes, or the things all the hippie looking boys wear nowadays? You know, the sort of shoes that slip on and you never have to clean them. Apparently they clean themselves by some extraordinary process or other. One of these labor saving gimmicks. I would not care for that at all, said Poirot severely. No, indeed. The trouble with you, said Mrs. Oliver, beginning to unwrap a package on the table, which she had obviously recently purchased. The trouble with you is that you insist on being smart. You mind more about your clothes and your mustaches and how you look and what you wear than comfort. Now, comfort is really the great thing. Once you've passed, say, 50, comfort is the only thing that matters. Madame, chère madame, I do not know that I agree with you. Well, you'd better, said Mrs. Oliver. If not, you will suffer a great deal and it will be worse year after year. I love the bickering, and she even comes back to it, and it causing Poirot to tell her in exasperation, Madame, I like to look soigné in my appearance. That's a great Ariadne Oliver and Poirot moment. We get some insight into Mrs. Oliver's writing process, as we often do in these books. She monologues about how she doesn't put people she knows in her books, just people she sees incidentally in public and who she's intrigued by. And if she ever gets to know them, it totally ruins it, because then she feels like the character can't be hers. That's so clearly taken directly from Christie. We also get, I think, actually one of the best sick burns as to taxes in any Christie. And it's actually coming from Joyce, the doomed Joyce, asking Mrs. Oliver. She says, you make a lot of money out of them, don't you? She's talking about her books. And this is what Christie writes. In a way, said Mrs. Oliver, her thoughts flying to the inland revenue. I love that Christie's able to have fun with Mrs. Oliver even in this late book. And
well, although it's really sad because Mrs. Oliver can't eat apples anymore. She has to now eat dates.
That was the package she was unwrapping in that exchange, by the way. She ends up getting her hands all sticky and it's like clearly a mess. And she's not really taking to them. But yeah, she's off apples. Poor Mrs. Oliver. As to Poirot, we opened with him being miffed that a sick friend of his has canceled on him. But I was miffed that we had never heard of him before, because I think that's just not okay this late in Poirot's career. Mr. Solomon Solly Levy, who had a catarrhal cold, which I also don't want to hear about that in the age of COVID. Thank you very much. But it's an okay Poirot book. He's not as present as he often is in these books, but he's somewhat present.
Mrs. Oliver is very good in it. So,
yes,
I mean,
Mrs.
so I would
Oliver's
rank
good.
it pretty. What were you thinking?
I would rank it pretty high. Actually, a 7 is too high, but I think a 5 is too low. So I guess I'm saying a 6.
I think that's fine. Yeah, Poirot is a little lacking in this, but Ariadne Oliver is really solid, I think.
And we do really get a lot of good continuity, as we mentioned. I mean, Dead Man's Folly and Mrs. McGinty's Dead and The Labors of Hercules are all mentioned, maybe even a little too much. We even get references to Butter in a Lordly Dish, which is a play that she wrote. Nemesis gets a half shout out. And my favorite is that Miss Bulstrode is an acquaintance of Miss Emily.
I know. Yeah, a cat amongst the pigeons.
We learned that Meadowbank has changed a little nowadays. Different aims, different methods. It still holds its own as a school of distinction, of progress, and also of tradition. So we know that Miss Bulstrode and Miss Rich succeeded after the end of Cat Among the Pigeons, and that makes me happy. So yeah, let's stick with a 6 for series-long characters. And then moving on into book-specific characters, I think this is very much a mixed bag. As we've discussed, a lot of these characters don't sing. I think that the children, actually all of them, except for Nicholas and Desmond, who I'll get to in a second, I think that Joyce and Leo are too brutally rendered, and I think Miranda is too fawningly rendered. And I just don't totally believe her as a character and what she does or doesn't do. I think there's a lot of convenience as to the way that Miranda is used in the plot.
Right.
Michael Garfield, he's Narcissus. He's sort of the stand-in for the evil youths in these late career Christies, where he's like the child of Satan, which,
it's directly said it's actually why Poirot decides he figures out the case.
Right. He references Satan and he's like, oh, right, you're Satan.
Yep.
That's a little silly. And Mrs. Reynolds, again, we talked ad nauseum about that, but I just think that I don't believe her as a mother. And I think that's a big problem in a book where 2 out of her 3 children have been murdered. I actually think Rowena Drake is a really good character because I think often these murderer characters don't get as much page real estate as they otherwise would because Christie has to hide the ball. But I think what she manages to do is to convey who Rowena Drake is and wants to be and would be, except for the fact that she is a horrendous serial killer.
It's a child murderer. But I'd say the best scene that she's in is her cry fest over telling Poirot that Leopold has died.
It is. It's very good. And it's funny that you should bring that up because I also highlighted that. I wasn't going to bring this up until we talked about setting, but I will just mention it now. I know this actually from our good friend Mark Aldridge in his other book, his more recent book that he published, Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World. But in preparation for Halloween Party, Christie apparently read multiple newspapers every day for 3 weeks in order to learn about contemporary crimes. And this is what she had to say about her perusal of the paper. So I'm quoting Christie now. Every day there was somebody murdered, some girl killed, some child missing and strangled. I think it's a sign of the times. There's more violence as a means of passing the time. You read about these boys saying we had nothing to do, so we thought we'd roll so-and-so, and some boy just sitting quietly is killed. Girls are very, very silly, if I may say so. They go out with men they've only known a few hours. When I was a girl, you used to be told, be careful. Don't get into trains alone with a strange man. Now let's compare that with what Mrs. Drake says in that very scene. It seems to me that crimes are so often associated nowadays with the young, people who don't really know quite what they are doing, who want silly revenges, who have an instinct for destruction. Even the people who wreck telephone boxes or who slash the tires of cars do all sorts of things just to hurt people, just because they hate not anyone in particular, but the whole world. It's a sort of symptom of this age. And it's so interesting because that's Christie's opinion, basically. And she's putting it in the mouth of one of her murderers. But we had those sort of references tangentially and very unnecessarily and by the pricking of my thumbs also. Like Tuppence kept on mentioning teens who would vandalize cemeteries. Right. And whatnot. And it clearly was just something that was on Christie's mind and that bothered her. And it's really interesting that she, in a significant way, I think, identifies with Rowena Drake. Rowena Drake, I think, is an unusually 3-dimensional murderer in a murder mystery. And I think that it's handled really well. I didn't think when it was revealed that she was the murderer, oh, well, that wasn't the real Rowena. And I feel like you totally didn't play fair by saying she was one kind of person, but then, you know, she actually is another. No, she's totally the kind of person who, of course, wears a mask. She always wore a mask of respectability. It's just that this mask was a much more hardcore mask than we realized. But that's fine. That's just a change of degree, not of kind.
Like, they're both relatively good because, Michael, there is a kind of narcissistic archetype.
Are you speaking from experience, Catherine?
Well, always. But there's a type who you could see being morally bankrupt, I guess, in order to create their art, right? Like he wants to create this perfect garden on this Greek island. He has one goal.
There are some good characters in this novel, but my ultimate sense of the book-specific characters is not great. I mean, I think that Rowena and Michael are the standouts. Otherwise, I think it gets a little wonky. And I'm obviously joking when I say that Nicholas and Desmond are my favorite characters. They're ridiculous. It's just that we haven't talked about, and this is actually, I think, something that this book is also famous for among Christie fans especially. But there's this one scene where Poirot is questioning Nicholas and Desmond, and they start theorizing about Joyce's murder. It really is laugh aloud funny because first Nicholas suggests that it's ESP. He says she saw a murder committed and within an hour or two, she herself was murdered. I suppose she had a sort of vision of it. Makes you think a bit. And then he goes on this, diatribe about ESP. Then Desmond's take is as follows. Whitaker, for my money, real old spinster, sex starved and all that teaching bottled up among a lot of women. You remember one of the teachers got strangled a year or two ago. She was a bit queer, they say. Lesbian? Asked Nicholas in a man of the world voice. I shouldn't wonder, replies Desmond. And with that, Christie has officially entered the modern era, hasn't she? Because she took the sub out of the subtext, and that is a direct reference to a homosexual, which we really never get otherwise. So that is
interesting. We certainly have subtextual references galore to homosexuality, as we've spoken about at great length. But it's interesting that that happens, especially within the context of this rather jokey passage overall, because it gets even crazier from there. Nicholas adds to the theory. He says that women do go a bit queer at that age because maybe she was 40 odd getting on for 50. And then, and I just want to read out the very end of that chapter, because it really did make me laugh. Then they theorize about the curate, and they say he might be a bit off his nut, original sin perhaps, and all that, and the water and the apples and the things. And then he starts theorizing that he went crazy. And then Nicholas jumps in. Perhaps he exposed himself to her first, said Nicholas hopefully. I mean, there's always got to be a sex background to all these things. They both looked with satisfied faces to Poirot. Well, said Poirot, you've certainly given me something to think about. And that's the end of the chapter. They're ridiculous characters, but I think it's interesting that she chose to include them and then also make them part of Poirot's plot to save Miranda. That too is ridiculous and very cartoony, but I appreciate the fact that we have two young boys, like two young men in the novel who aren't evil children of Satan. It's nice. It balances things out a little bit in a way that Christie didn't really do so much in. And they wear
some like great velvet pants. So like all very good. What are we giving?
I know after all of this talking about how well she handles Rowena and Michael, I still think we need to go a bit low because Christie usually is really good at character. And I think there are just so many clunkers in here. So I'm going on a 4 because I think I was going to say a 3, honestly, but I think that's too low.
4 sounds good. So setting and tone is a little rough, I think.
We actually have a lot as to setting in the book, which I think we don't always get in Christie. I mean, we just talked about how Christie read the paper for 3 weeks. And I think even though we'll get into some issues that are stuck in their time in a moment, it is evocative. I will say my favorite thing that anchors the story very much in the late 60s is that preoccupation that Michael and Rowena have with the Greek island. Because even at the end, Mrs. Oliver kind of calls it out where she says, wait, this was all for a Greek island? What? And this is what Poirot says. Perhaps Michael Garfield read in the paper of a shipping millionaire who had created an island garden for the woman he loved. That is a pretty clear reference to the wedding of Jackie Kennedy to Aristotle Onassis, which took place on Onassis's private island of Scorpios on October 20th, 1968. So that tracks. That would be Jackie's big fat Greek wedding. And really, this whole thing is not Ariadne Oliver's fault. It's Jackie O's.
By the way, coincidence, we're also entering Scorpio season, which is meaningful to one Catherine Brobeck.
Oh boy. Mm-hmm. Yes, Catherine, your birthday's coming up. I'm aware. I like that. I mean, it's also a little goofy, but again, this really does feel like it's written in the late 60s. The Halloween setting generally and the Halloween party specifically, I think are very well rendered. We can see the party. Again, one of our listeners was able to recreate it in real life. That's meaningful. And I actually think the sunken garden is fairly well rendered. It's very bombastic and beautiful and overblown. It's also kind of creepy. I appreciated the detail that there were seats set up at convenient angles and intervals for the aged Mrs. Llewellyn Smith, because that is exactly how the garden at Greenway was set up for Christie. And Poirot also is talking about how he prefers the simplicity of a Devonshire countryside, green banks with great carpets of primroses on them. That's obviously Christie's preference. There's a lot of scene setting and painting in this book, which is, again, a little bit of a mess, but it does have a lot to like. I did also just find this comment really fascinating that Mrs. Oliver had never been fond of plastic things, because that is just not something that you could say now. I mean, that is where 1969 was a while ago, right? It was 50 years ago, and there wasn't as much plastic around then as there is now, because it just doesn't even make sense to say you don't like plastic things now. I mean, actually, people
I don't
say
particularly like plastic things, but
I don't necessarily know that I love plastic, but it's said in a very offhand way, and you can
also
tell.
Apparently, if it would have been a plastic bucket, Joyce wouldn't have been murdered.
I know. It's true. It's just the way it's said, you can tell that it's not a world in which plastic is everywhere. And I should also note that we do get a reference to a computer.
Mrs. Oliver tells Poirot that he sounds like a computer. You're programming yourself. That's what they call it, isn't it? I mean, you're feeding all these things into yourself all day, and then you're going to see what comes out. So that's her idea of a computer. We get like a Charabanc reference, breakfast cereals in the supermarket. There's a lot of scene setting. So for setting, I would say the book actually does really well. I think it's just when it comes to tone, as we said, the book sags in the middle. It's very repetitive. It's not as zippy a read as we're used to with Christie. And even though it does all hold together and I think acquits itself better than some of these other later career Christies, it still feels like a later career Christie. And that's...
Yeah. So where are we landing?
I think that this is another category where the setting and tone taken together are kind of middling. And I think that means we should give it a 5.
Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, so we have our final category, which is depictions stuck in their time. And I, at first, just want to give a tiny preamble here, because what we have in this book is a heavy element of ableism. And there's ableism throughout all of Christie. And it is honestly something that we've neglected in our analysis of the oeuvre thus far. So just to be clear, what we mean by ableism is the notion of discriminating against people who have disabilities or who are perceived to have disabilities. And those disabilities can obviously be physical, they could be mental. And also, to give credit here, I'm really cribbing a lot of this from one of you, dear listeners, who wrote us one of the loveliest emails that I think we've ever received. And it really was calling us out in the nicest and most constructive way possible on the fact that we haven't really addressed this particular depiction stuck in its time on the podcast thus far. I think that one of you mentioned it in our special holiday episode where you all submitted some listener reflections, but we really have neglected this one. So I just want to explain it a little bit before I get into the particular instance in this novel. You know, we have this idea of internalized ableism, meaning that those who have disabilities or perceived disabilities, they've internalized the idea that they're somehow less worthy than those who don't have those disabilities or perceived disabilities. And that means that people cut themselves off. They stop trying to achieve, or maybe they never tried to achieve the same fulfillment that quote unquote healthy people do. There are lots of instances of that sort of internalized ableism in Christie's work. And I think, you know, most often it's in the form of chronic illness or disability that's used to emphasize distance between a person and his or her children. No spoilers here, but, you know, we're thinking of Mrs. Boynton in Appointment with Death, Simeon Lee in Hercule Poirot's Christmas, Jason Rayfield in A Caribbean Mystery. There are so many more. That's really just 3 among many. And then even when we see disabled characters doing well in their careers, such as Angela Warren in Five Little Pigs, Conway Jefferson in The Body in the Library, they either have no romantic or family life, that would be Angela, or they make a mess of that aspect of their existence, that would be Conway. Obviously messy and dysfunctional families abound in Christie, but it does seem as if these disabled characters are disproportionately incapable of maintaining intimate bonds when compared to those who aren't depicted this way in Christie. So that is all by way of a preamble as a sort of mea culpa as to something that we should have brought up before now. And, you know, I'm hopeful that we and you will be able to discuss it more in the future. But in this book, we have something a lot more overt than internalized ableism. And it's the notion, which is repeated constantly, that these days, and I'm quoting now, there are queer children about, children who, well, once I suppose they would have been in mental homes and things, but they send them home now and tell them to lead ordinary lives or something. And then they go and do something like this. That is obviously ableism writ large as to mental disabilities or perceived mental disabilities. And after this first mention, Christie comes back to it 9 more times in the book. 9 times. It might be more. That is just what I was able to count. I probably missed a few. 3 of those times are from the lips of a medical doctor. 1 of those times it's a lawyer who's saying it, and he uses the R word in the process. Another time, while the narrator is sort of chronicling Poirot's musings on the subject, the R word comes up again. And, you know, I mean, I suppose you could say that ultimately the mentally challenged portion of the population is vindicated in that Rowena and Michael did it. And they are obviously horrible people, but they have all their faculties. You know, that is just very little cold comfort, because this idea about people with mental disabilities or perceived mental disabilities, it's just a nasty through line in the book, and it's really inescapable.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time talking about this, and I think that it's not meant for the end of an episode, honestly, but it has to be discussed within this one. What I would really like is if perhaps listeners, if you're interested, we could have another episode like we did last year where you write us or you send us voice memos. I know that I had a severely disabled aunt, and I was certainly a sick child. And I think that when you actually deal with that, you don't want to just address it lightly. So I think that one of the things that we might want to do is to do another episode where we get feedback on what that looks like in the similar context as the episode that we did last year, and how, the changes of terms and the changes of depictions, or perhaps the lack of change in depictions of chronic illness, mental illness, disability affects reading, because it certainly must. I certainly think it does. So yeah, this book does not do at all well in those terms.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously agree with everything you're saying as to welcoming other voices on this topic. I think that's actually a crucial aspect of having more of a discussion, and probably part of the reason as to why we haven't brought it up. We should have brought it up before now, but I think it's one that requires more voices. Just to wrap up the depictions stuck in their time category, we do also have Mrs. Drake's husband, who is an object of pity for contracting polio and being confined to a wheelchair. That problematic lawyer who I heard he referenced, he says, sad business to know you're a cripple for life. That is absolutely something that's, I think, hard to read nowadays. There are also even a few other stray issues. Poirot, at one point, he and Spence are actually reminiscing about the lovers at the end of Mrs. McGinty's Dead, how they ended up. And he says, it is one of the great consolations in nature that a man, however unattractive, will find that he is attractive to some woman. Putting aside the heteronormativity of that statement, because of course we have to, I'm fine with that so long as Poirot would be okay reversing that every woman, however unattractive, will find that she is attracted to some man. But I actually don't think that he would reverse that. I don't think that is a reversible, gender flippable statement in context in the book.
Right.
And I think that such ideas are what incel culture is based on. That's an extrapolation, obviously. I'm not saying that Poirot is an incel, just to be clear here, but there's a direct line from one to the other. We have a tangential character referred to as half gypsy in a temperamental piece, but that's in the mouth of Superintendent Spence. And then also just why did the restaurant that Mrs. Oliver and the butler stop at while they're fleeing Woodley Common, why did it have to be called the Black Boy? Because that gets referenced 3 times. It just seems unnecessary. We already talked, I think, about the depictions of Miranda in particular, which seem a little problematic. But I would also like to give Christie credit for a moment where Poirot quotes the Quran and Mrs. Drake, the murderer, says, I hope we do not take our ideas, or perhaps I should say ideals, from the Middle East. It's in some ways a good and inclusive moment for Christie. So where are we coming down on Stuck in Its Time here, Catherine?
I mean, I think at minimum 3.
Yeah, I agree. Perhaps more, but let's leave it at 3. That seems right to me as well. We are going to tally up the score here for Halloween Party. We've got 5 plus 7 plus 6 plus 4 plus 5 minus 3 for a grand total of 24 points, putting Halloween Party in a big old tie. This seems to be where a lot of these later Christie books go, Catherine. At 24 points, we have, in descending order, The Moving Finger, Dumb Witness, Murder is Easy, By the Pricking of My Thumbs, At Bertram's Hotel, The Murder on the Links, and The Mystery of the Blue Train. We are going to be revisiting our rankings in our very next episode. So we will be doing some revising here, but I feel very strongly, as I'm sure you do as well, that The Moving Finger, Dumb Witness, and Murder is Easy are better books than Halloween Party.
Yep.
Okay. I actually think that it should go above By the Pricking of My Thumbs, At Bertram's Hotel, The Murder on the Links, and The Mystery of the Blue Train.
I don't know that I agree with that, but we can put it there for now. We'll revisit it on the next episode.
Yeah,
but
low stakes, right? You can fiddle with that if need be. All right. So we are going to put Halloween Party in 47th place of 60 books. We are now at 60. Christie's covered. We only have 6 left, Catherine. Well, it's been quite a Halloween party. And as we just mentioned, in our next episode, we are going to be revisiting our rankings. So that'll be a state of the rankings episode. And we will release graphs for you to consult when you're listening to that episode.
Get excited.
Get excited. Just to give you a heads up, the episode after that, we're going to be covering How Does Your Garden Grow? A Poirot short story. And some of you may know why we're covering that right after this novel, but that will become very obvious when you read the story or when you just listen to us discuss it in that episode. And until then, if you haven't gotten enough of us in this supersized episode, although I really can't imagine that that is possible, you could head on over to our Patreon account to hear Catherine tell her own ghost story about a haunting that she experienced. I am not making that up, people. She really does tell her own ghost story.
Definitely do tell a ghost story.
That would be over at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. And again, in particular, as to depictions of ableism stuck in their time, we really do hope to hear from some of you in the near future on that. You can find us on Twitter at All About the Dame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And if you haven't already done so, please do take a moment to give us a rating or a review. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's Knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.